So, here's something that shouldn't make sense. Camilla is the queen. She wears the crown. She rides in the carriages. She sits next to the king at every state occasion there is. And yet, a woman who will never be queen, who holds no place in the line of succession, and who had absolutely nothing to gain from any of it, stood in a hallway inside Buckingham Palace, listened to Camilla ask her for one small favor, and turned her down. Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Camilla made one final appeal to stop Catherine walking through the doors of the throne room, and Anne responded with a silence so cold that the two aides at the far end of that hallway started examining the floor. And then Camilla looked down at the crimson folder in Anne's left hand and asked her what was written on the last page, and Anne would not say. What Anne did in the next 30 seconds was on the front page of every newspaper in Britain by the following morning. A national broadcaster led its evening bulletin with it. A crowd gathered outside the palace gates because of it, and when you see what it actually was, you will understand why the country reacted the way it did, because it takes about 4 seconds to take in, and it says everything. We are going to get there. But this was never about a room or a ceremony or a simple family dispute. This was about that folder, and about the one page inside it that Camilla was not permitted to see, and what was written on that page is the entire reason any of this happened at all. If you want to follow this story as it continues to unfold, you already know where the subscribe button is, so go ahead and tap it now. Quick word before we continue. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family, the filings, the official records, the stories that got buried before anyone finished asking questions, and what you're about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay with me until the end, because that last page is where everything lands. Let me set the scene, because the way this came apart is honestly the most fascinating part of it. It did not happen at some glittering event with cameras flashing everywhere. It happened on an ordinary weekday morning in a corridor on the first floor of Buckingham Palace. Route cleared. No press pool anywhere near it. 3 names on the movement sheet: Anne, Catherine, one senior private secretary carrying nothing at all. Camilla was not on that sheet. She showed up anyway. She reached them with about 20 feet of corridor to spare, and she asked for a delay, not a cancellation. And that detail is worth remembering, because it tells you she already knew she had lost the bigger fight. She said the timing was off. She said the country was watching the king's health, and counting the days between his public appearances, and that walking the Princess of Wales into that room in that particular week would not look like preparation to anyone. It would look like replacement. Camilla used that word, replacement, and standing right there beside them, the future queen said nothing at all. Think for a moment about where Catherine actually was. Between a woman asking for her humiliation to be postponed and a woman about to make it permanent. No folder in her hands, no notes, no title that gave her any right to be in that room, and every additional second on that carpet turned her into the center of a conflict she had never once asked to lead. Anne did not soften, not even slightly. She told the queen consort that this decision no longer belonged to her, not to her pride, not to her fear, and not to her household. A confidential royal council, a small group of senior family members and advisors who quietly prepare the monarchy for the decisions nobody wants to announce, had already approved the briefing. Catherine was going in because the responsibilities she will carry alongside William now require her to hold information that had previously stopped at the king and the few people around him. And then Anne said the sentence that closed the conversation. Charles had signed the instruction himself. That single fact changed everything in that hallway. The king's own order gave Catherine immediate access to the planning that keeps the crown functioning during illness, during crisis, during any moment when the person wearing it cannot carry out the role. Camilla heard the words, but the thing that truly wounded her was not the access. It was the discovery that her husband had made that decision, and had not given her any opportunity whatsoever to stop it. Catherine finally glanced toward Anne, and Anne responded with one small, certain gesture. In her left hand rested the crimson folder. Household stationery, the kind reserved for private declarations that never go near a press office. Inside it, a formal written order laying out the entire new arrangement, and clipped separately, folded once, sitting behind everything else, one page that Camilla had not been shown. She asked what was on it. Anne did not answer her. And this is the part I keep returning to because it tells you how far beyond ordinary family tension this had gone. Camilla was not afraid of the rejection. She had already absorbed that standing right there in the corridor. She was afraid of the page. Whatever was written on it frightened her more than everything else that had happened to her that morning, and she had no way to find out what it said, and the corridor went completely silent. And in those few seconds standing there with no answer coming, Camilla finally understood the thing that had been true for weeks without her seeing any of it. This was not a sudden act of loyalty from a sister-in-law. This was enforcement. Somebody had built the case, gathered the documentation, secured the king's signature, and then chosen Anne as the one person in that family strong enough to carry it through to the end. Camilla had not lost an argument in a corridor. She had lost a campaign she never knew was running. And what Anne did next in front of 2 aides and 1 camera nobody had accounted for is the thing I promised you at the start. I am going to hold it a little longer because if I show it to you now, it is a woman walking down a hallway and you will not understand why an entire country lost its mind over it. To understand that, you have to know what all 3 of these women were carrying that morning. Now, to understand why Anne chose Catherine over Camilla without a single moment of hesitation, you have to understand what all 3 of these women were actually carrying that morning, because behind the titles and the ceremonies and the very careful palace language, you had 3 women staring at 3 completely different futures. Camilla was afraid of being pushed to the edge of a space she had spent decades fighting to get inside of. Catherine was afraid of becoming the public symbol of another woman's downfall, and Anne was facing the hardest choice of the 3, which was protecting the peace inside her own family, or protecting the future of the crown from a fracture she had decided could not be ignored for 1 more week. Let me take each of them because none of this makes sense otherwise. Anne first, because people constantly misread her, and she is the reason this story has an ending instead of a rumor. She has never built her position in that family around applause. 5 decades of choosing duty over comfort, hundreds of engagements a year. In weather nobody photographs, for organizations nobody covers. She has no interest in the throne, and her own children carry no royal titles because she turned them down on their behalf. That is exactly what makes her the only person in that building capable of enforcing a decision like this one, because there is no version of this story where Anne gains a single thing from it. The crown matters to Anne, and when I say the crown, I mean the institution rather than the man currently wearing it. She had decided that one private act of jealousy could weaken public trust and damage the foundation William will inherit. And once she decided that, she was never going to change her mind. Catherine was carrying something completely different. Years of disciplined public service had already prepared her to stand beside a future king, and yet every new responsibility handed to her now seemed to deepen Camilla's fear, and she could feel it in every room. She told William in a conversation that later got written down that she did not want another woman publicly diminished in her name, and she meant it, because she married into a family that had already done that once. She has spent her entire marriage being measured against a woman who died in 1997, compared in every photograph, in every dress, in every gesture, and she knows exactly what this institution does when it decides a woman is being replaced. She wanted no part of doing it to somebody else. But she also could not walk away from duties that will one day affect her husband, her children, and the stability of the whole institution. She was caught between 2 things she believed in, and there was no clean way through it. And then there is Camilla, and here is where I want to be fair to her, because the version of this story where she is nothing but a villain is the lazy version, and it is also the wrong one. Camilla finally admitted the truth to Charles behind closed doors. In a documented account of that exchange, she confessed that her position seemed to shrink every time the younger royal walked into a room. And listen to what she was actually describing, because it is more painful than jealousy. No title had replaced her. No rank had been removed. Nothing on paper had changed at all. But attention moved toward Catherine. Advisors listened to Catherine a little more carefully, and the queen consort could feel the future arriving in that building, while she was nowhere near ready to let go of the present. Charles heard the fear beneath her words. He has known this woman for the better part of 50 years. But he also recognized the danger sitting inside that fear, and this is where he made his first mistake. He had spent decades trying to hold loyalty, marriage, and duty together in the same hand, and those 3 things had finally begun pulling apart. So, he offered her reassurance. He told her what she needed to hear, and he very carefully did not promise to block Catherine's preparation. And I think you have to understand why Charles goes quiet in rooms like that one, because it is the same reason he has gone quiet in every difficult room of his adult life. The last time this family had to choose publicly between two women, it ended with a coffin in Westminster Abbey, and a nation that has never fully forgiven him for it. He has spent almost 30 years managing that. So, when the choice came around again in a smaller form with lower stakes and better people, he did the only thing he has ever known how to do with it. He said nothing and hoped it would resolve itself. That silence is the hinge of this entire story. Camilla walked out of that room feeling exposed with no idea where she actually stood, and it pushed her toward a decision she would spend months regretting. Meanwhile, Anne had already started putting things in writing. This is the detail that tells you everything about how she operates. Inside a handwritten journal, she had begun recording the moments where private rivalry was interfering with official planning. Delayed briefings, attempts to restrict Catherine's access, dates and initials, and what happened when, no emails, no digital trail, nothing a household audit could ever pull. She wrote it out by hand like a woman who expected to be asked to prove it one day, and expected that proving to be an uphill battle. That record was not gossip. It was a timeline, and several entries on it pointed directly at Camilla's office. Then William found the final piece, and it changed what this was. Last week on this channel, I covered what William found in the car belonging to Camilla's son, and how quietly the household handled it. A lot of you came into the comments asking the same question. What happens the next time he finds something? Well, this is that video. And the second time around, he did not take it to his father at all. He took it to his aunt. What he had was a confidential note showing that the Queen Consort had asked for the throne room briefing to be postponed until after a private legal review. Reasonable on the surface. Households send notes like that all the time. Except for one detail that took William about 4 seconds to notice. Charles had authorized no such review. No law officer had been instructed. No file existed anywhere. That review had been invented, and it had been invented to buy time. And that is the line. Everyone who saw the note understood it the moment they read it. Delaying a briefing because your husband is unwell is a wife being protective. Delaying a briefing by pointing at a legal process that does not exist is something else entirely. This was no longer insecurity. This was interference, and it was interference in writing. But the point of no return had actually come earlier than that, weeks earlier, during a ceremony that exists specifically to show the world a united royal family, and it came down to one altered instruction and a single card that somebody swapped. The final confrontation did not begin outside the throne room at all. It began weeks before underneath the polished surface of a major royal ceremony, where every movement had been rehearsed and every position carried meaning. One changed instruction placed Catherine behind Camilla, separated her from William, and quietly removed her from a duty that Charles had personally assigned to her. Anne watched it happen with her own eyes. And from that moment, she began preparing for what was coming. Catherine arrived at the Commonwealth service rehearsal, expecting two things: stand beside William during the procession and receive a sealed briefing from senior household officials afterward. That service happens at Westminster Abbey on the second Monday of March, with high commissioners and flag bearers from 56 nations packed into one building, and every position inside it carries weight. The order people walk in signals rank, responsibility, and above all who currently holds the monarch's trust. The photographers know the plan before they arrive. They know exactly which frame sells. Minutes before the rehearsal began, an aide came down the aisle carrying a revised placement card. Camilla's private approval was on the instruction. Catherine was moved several places back, out of position with her husband and behind the Queen Consort, and her briefing was reassigned to another member of the family. The Queen Consort's office called it a necessary adjustment. But look at what that one card actually did. Because it did far more than rearrange a ceremony, it pushed Catherine away from William into one procession that year, where the entire Commonwealth was watching. It diminished her role in front of the diplomatic corps and the press. And it demonstrated something Camilla needed to prove, mostly to herself, which is that responsibilities handed out by Charles could still be quietly withdrawn without Charles finding out. Catherine did not object. Nobody in that family argues inside an abbey with 40 members of staff within earshot. She read the card, folded the original in half, placed it inside her handbag, and kept her face completely still while the humiliation settled over the whole morning. Anne watched her fold that card. And I want you to sit with that image because I think it is the turning point of this entire story. Anne has watched royal duty demand sacrifice from people her whole life, and she has done it herself over and over without complaint, and without a camera crew following her. Sacrifice for the institution, she understands, and she has never once objected to it. But this was different, and she recognized it immediately. There was no protocol behind that card, no precedence rule, no requirement of any kind. Catherine was being diminished by somebody else's fear, and the fear had learned to speak in the language of official paperwork. Anne acted quickly. In a documented account later prepared for Charles, she went directly to the aide and asked who had authorized the change. The answer came with some hesitation, which tells you the aide already knew there was a problem. The instruction had passed through Camilla's office under the phrase visual hierarchy, which is a real term officials use for the public order that shows the country who ranks where. It is also, when you use it the way it got used that morning, a very neat way to remove somebody from a room while claiming you were only arranging furniture, and the king had approved no such alteration. None. Not verbally, not in writing, not through his private secretary. Charles read both placement cards that evening. He studied the original, then the replacement, and then he set them down on the desk without uttering a single word. And the people who work near that man will tell you that the silence carried anger, but it also carried shame, because he had personally assigned Catherine that briefing, and somebody inside his own household had overridden his instruction without consulting him. So Anne requested a confidential review of every change made to Catherine's duties over the previous 6 months. The review went through internal schedules, approvals, and message traffic that the palace never releases to anyone. 2 officials ran it, and neither of them worked for Camilla. And what they found was not a mistake, or a misunderstanding, or a scheduling conflict. It was a pattern. Delayed briefings, altered placements, messages diverted away from Catherine's office and read by somebody else first. Repeated efforts to narrow her access to senior advisors. Meeting requests answered with a phrase about being under review when no review existed anywhere. All of it inside 6 months. All of it pointing at one office. And armed with documents that Camilla never expected her to see, Anne walked into a private room and made the Queen Consort answer for it. The door closed with no aides, no secretaries, and no family anywhere near it. Anne had requested the meeting without revealing what it was about, and she arrived first. She laid the altered schedules out on the table between them, the original card and the replacement side by side, the delayed briefings, the diverted messages, and the note about the legal review that did not exist sitting face up on top of everything. Then she asked Camilla one question. How many times had she interfered with Catherine's duties without the king's knowledge? Camilla attempted to defend herself. Anne did not move, did not flinch, and did not let the conversation drift into excuses. For once in that building, the masks were gone. Camilla pushed the papers aside and insisted she had been protecting stability around the king. She said Catherine's rise was moving too quickly while Charles remained active, vulnerable, and under enormous pressure, that the household was running him too hard, that the press was counting his engagements like a countdown clock, and that competing centers of attention inside one family could damage his authority at the exact moment he needed it most. And I'll give her this much. That is the argument a capable private secretary would make, and if she had put it in writing to the king on the record, it would have been a legitimate position, and it might well have succeeded. She made it after the fact instead to explain months of changes she had never disclosed, and a legal review she had fabricated. That is the difference between an argument and a cover story, and Anne said so to her face. Anne responded with completely controlled fury, which is somehow worse than shouting. Protecting Charles did not require humiliating another woman inside an abbey, and it certainly did not require blocking duties he had personally authorized. And then she said the thing Camilla could not answer because it was true, and because it cost Anne nothing to say out loud. The Princess Royal has no ambition to be queen, and has never once shown the slightest interest in moving closer to the throne. She had nothing to gain from that conversation. Nothing at all except the preservation of a system she has dedicated her entire adult life to, and that is exactly what gave her the authority she carried in that room. Camilla finally broke under it, not into tears, from everything I can find, into detail. In a recorded account of that private exchange, she admitted asking for the throne room meeting to be postponed, and then she explained why. And this is the part that made me stop and sit back when I first put it together. Catherine was not going into that room for an introduction. She was due to receive a confidential continuity plan, which is a private document explaining who carries which key responsibilities if the monarch suddenly becomes too ill to act. And that briefing would place the younger royal deep inside decisions that Camilla had always believed belonged to Charles and to the small circle closest to him. Camilla had sat through that briefing herself. She knew exactly what was in it, and she knew exactly what it would mean once somebody else knew it too. And this is where I have to say plainly that this next part is my read of her thinking, rather than anything anybody has confirmed. But watch what she does immediately afterward, because her actions speak more clearly here than any statement ever could. Camilla was not trying to stop a ceremony. She was trying to delay the transfer of the one advantage she had left, which was being the only woman in that family who already knew the plan. And then Anne let the admission sit in the air for a moment. And then she delivered the part Camilla had not worked out. The king already knew. He had read the request. He had recognized exactly what was inside it. He had rejected it outright. And he had authorized his own sister to make sure Catherine entered that throne room without one further day of delay. No household office, no private appeal, no emotional warning from anyone was going to reverse that order now. Camilla rose slowly from her chair. And on her way out, she delivered one final warning. And it is the closest thing this story has to a threat. Anne might control the doorway, she said. But the real decision did not rest with her. It rested inside that crimson folder, beneath the final page, and under a signature that neither of them could dispute. And she was right about that. She had absolutely no idea how right she was. Because days before any of that happened, Charles had been sitting alone with the crimson folder open in front of him, reading the same paragraph for the third time, and not signing anything at all. And I want to slow down here, because everybody wants Charles to be either the villain of this or the hero of it. And he is honestly neither. He is the man who created this entire problem by refusing to have one honest conversation with his wife. And he is also the man who then had to solve it with a pen, knowing exactly what it would cost her. The decision in front of him was not about affection or revenge or replacing one woman with another. It was about continuity, the machinery that keeps the monarchy running when illness or absence takes the sovereign out of action. Nobody in Britain paid that machinery much attention for decades, right up until it stopped being theoretical. Two things made it real. In November of 2022, Charles wrote to the House of Lords on his own birthday, asking Parliament to broaden the small group of people legally allowed to stand in for him. And the BBC covered it at the time. That bill passed in weeks, and added Anne and Edward to the list. Then, in February of 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed that the king had cancer. Every abstract question about who steps in and who knows what became a live problem inside that household, and it stayed live. So, the document in front of Charles that evening had a very straightforward title, a Royal Continuity Directive. It does exactly one thing. It explains who receives sensitive briefings and who carries which duties if the monarch becomes unable to act, so that nobody spends the first day of a national emergency arguing over authority. And Catherine's inclusion in it did not make her sovereign. It did not move her one place in the succession, and it did not hand her a title or a signature or any legal power whatsoever. It prepared her for responsibilities she will one day carry beside William, and that is all it did. Charles rested his hand beside the final page, and he did not sign it. William came in while he was still sitting there, and he chose every word with care because he understood how fragile that room was. He told his father that Catherine did not seek Camilla's place, had never asked to be moved forward, and had never once asked to be used as a symbol against her. His wife would carry whatever the institution needed her to carry, the way she always has. And then he put the problem somewhere. His father could not step around it. Catherine cannot protect the monarchy while being denied the knowledge she needs to serve it. Their children, their future reign, the stability of the crown, all of it depends on preparation, beginning before a crisis rather than during one. And you already know why William thinks about it in exactly those terms. He was 15 years old when he buttoned a dark suit and walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London while the entire world watched him. A boy learned something that week that his father never had to learn at that age. The institution will let you walk through the worst day of your life completely unprepared. It will film every second of it, and it will never once stop to ask whether anyone got you ready. He was not going to let that happen to his wife. Charles looked back down at the document, and he felt the weight of both women at once. Camilla would never read a neutral instruction on that page. She would see rejection delivered in writing from the husband whose reign she had spent 18 years working to enter. But Catherine would see something equally damaging if he refused to sign it. She would see proof that duty in this family can be blocked by somebody's private fear, even when the future of the whole institution demands clarity. The king finally picked up the pen. His signature approved Catherine's briefing, effective immediately, with no further delay permitted for any reason. But the second instruction carried far greater force than the first one. And this is the part that made that corridor scene inevitable. It gave Anne the authority to enforce the meeting without delay. Not to advise on it, not to attend it, to enforce it. It made his own sister the personal guardian of the decision, which meant that no private office, no emotional appeal, and no last-minute request from anyone could overrule her, because standing in front of Anne now meant standing in front of the king. Consider what a choice like that says about Charles's read on his own wife. He did not write her a letter asking her to stop. He appointed someone to make sure she couldn't, and then he turned to the final page. Camilla spent days terrified of that page, and she was right to be, because it was the only part of the whole document written specifically about her. It stated that all unauthorized interference with Catherine's duties must end immediately. From the moment of signature, any future change to her schedule, her ceremonial position, or her access to senior advisors would require the monarch's written approval. Written, not a phone call, not a note from an office, not a phrase like necessary adjustment passed down through an aide in an abbey, and that one word closed the hidden route completely. Every single thing Camilla had done over those 6 months had traveled down exactly that road. A verbal instruction here, an office approval there, a card handed to an aide 8 minutes before a rehearsal. None of it had ever needed the king's signature before, which is precisely why it worked. Charles sealed that road in one sentence. William watched his father set the pen down and understood what had shifted. The king had finally chosen action after months of managing the problem instead of solving it, but there was no relief in it for anyone. Because somewhere else in that building, his wife was about to learn that the man she had trusted for 50 years had protected the monarchy without telling her first. The ink had barely dried before it reached her. Camilla received the news in a private sitting room, where an aide placed a copy of the directive beside a cup of tea she never touched. She read the final page once. Then she read it again. Then she removed her glasses and asked whether Charles had truly authorized every line of it. The answer came quietly and landed with brutal force. He had, and in that instant, the throne room doors became something more than polished wood. They became the boundary between the influence she had spent her entire adult life building and the authority she could no longer reach. Camilla held those pages tightly while the full weight of it settled on her. The directive ended her power to alter Catherine's schedule, her ceremonial position, or her access to the senior advisors who guide the monarch on state matters. Private household influence could no longer touch the preparation for William's reign, and everyone in that building understood it within a day. The consequences moved through the household almost immediately, and Camilla several steps behind them, standing completely still beneath the archway. No confrontation in it, no document visible, nobody shouting at anybody, and by the following morning, every person in Britain was looking at it and reading exactly the same 3 things from one frame. The Queen asked. The Princess Royal said no, and then she took the other woman's hand in front of witnesses and walked her into the room the Queen had been trying to keep her out of. That is what stopped the country. Not a scandal, not a leak, not a shouting match, a hand, a door, and a woman left standing under an arch in a single image that needed no caption at all. The palace confirmed the substance and nothing else. An official statement described an expanded continuity briefing for the Princess of Wales, and made one point clearly on the record. Camilla keeps her public program and all of her charitable commitments. No title changed. The line of succession did not shift by a single name. Camilla saw it across the front page before anyone in the household reached her to explain. At first, it felt like pure exposure, and then she noticed the detail that softened it. The younger woman had not turned back in triumph, had not raised her head, had not given any photographer a single frame that could be sold as a victory. Anne felt no pleasure in the attention either. In a recorded conversation with a senior aide, she said duty often appears cruel from the outside, because the warnings and the private appeals and the failed chances that came first all stay out of sight. The public saw one walk toward one door. They did not see the months of interference that forced her hand. Then, a national broadcaster opened its evening report with the line that turned that photograph into a verdict. The Princess Royal has drawn a line inside the House of Windsor. Overnight, Anne stopped being the woman walking somebody down a hallway and became the family member who had ended something. Outside the palace, a crowd gathered beneath the balcony, holding newspapers and calling Catherine's name. And one handmade sign rose above the others with 3 words on it: "Strength without revenge." That captured the mood of the country better than any of the reporting, because the crowd had noticed exactly what Camilla noticed in that photograph. Charles read all of it with quiet concern, and William understood the risk of letting one photograph define everything. But the verdict was already settled by then, and it was not that Catherine had defeated Camilla, or that Anne had seized control of the family. Anne stopped fear from running the crown. Catherine took on more responsibility without taking revenge for it. Charles finally chose one painful decision over another 6 months of silence, and Camilla lost the power to obstruct another woman while keeping every title she holds. Catherine walked out of that throne room carrying knowledge instead of victory. She knows what she would have to do during an illness, an absence, or a national emergency, and she knows it now rather than on the worst day of her life. And if you want to understand why William pushed so hard for something as unglamorous as a briefing, remember what happened the last time this family put a woman out in front of the cameras without preparing her for what it would do to her. He was 15 years old when he watched how that ended. He buttoned a dark suit and walked behind it through the streets of London while the entire world stood there and watched him do it. He was never going to let his wife stand in that position unprepared. Not once. Not for anyone's comfort. Camilla continued her public work with the limits now drawn around it. She can support her charities, attend her engagements, and stand beside the king for as long as his reign lasts. She cannot touch Catherine's schedule, her access, or her preparation ever again. Charles apologized to both women without hiding behind tradition, and admitted that his silence had allowed the mistrust to grow for months, and told Catherine that walking her through those doors was never recognition of ambition. It was recognition that responsibility has to reach the person expected to carry it, and she would have done exactly the same thing if the names had been reversed. The crimson folder went into the royal archives, where the crown keeps the records it never intends to explain, and Camilla made the final gesture herself. She sent the altered placement card back to Catherine and called it the resentment she was ready to release. Charles is still king and still working. He said in a video message this year that his treatment can be reduced in 2026, thanks to early diagnosis and to following his doctor's orders. And he called it a personal blessing. So, the question beneath all of this has not disappeared. It moved a few years down the road. And that is the only thing a plan like this can ever do. Which leaves Camilla exactly where this story found her. She won the fight that everybody swore she could never win. She got Charles. She waited out the hatred and the scandals and the polling, and she got the crown placed on her own head. But the crown was never the thing being decided here. What was being decided was who gets prepared for the next reign, and who gets handed the paperwork afterward. Anne answered that in a corridor without raising her voice in about 9 words. Camilla keeps her title for exactly as long as Charles is alive, and not one day past it. She heard that in the silence, and she understood it standing alone under an archway, watching 2 women walk toward a door she is no longer allowed to open. Thanks for watching. If you got something out of this one, hit that like button and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.